Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Short. Welcome to Automating Jamf using Okta Workflows, and welcome to JNUC 2022. This is the first JNUC that I'll be attending in person, so if you see me around in San Diego, please come by and say hi. Before we get started, I just have a couple of quick intros and kind of housekeeping matters. All of the workflow examples that I talk about and I reference in this presentation are going to be posted on my GitHub. So there's going to be links and a QR code on the last slide so that you can all have templates to upload to your own instances of Okta Workflows. So like I said, my name is Stephen Short. I am the Senior IT Systems Admin at Disco. We're a legal tech company based in Austin, Texas, and my role focuses on identity management between multiple apps and services using Okta single sign-on and also managing all of our Apple devices using Jamf. I've been with Disco almost 3 years, and during that time, I've been responsible for architecting and managing all of the onboarding and offboarding processes. And I use Okta Workflows to complete most of those tasks. So what is Okta Workflows? In short, it's a no-code automation platform, and it makes the process of automating actions between Jamf and Okta much easier to test and to implement. If you've used Okta at all for some time, you may already be taking advantage of app provisioning or deprovisioning, just kind of with the native functions built into Okta, or even the automated group rules that are in Okta. So a great example of that is, let's say there's a user who is switching teams or departments at your organization, and the new team they're going to need a Microsoft Office license. So a group rule in Okta could automatically scope the person to the appropriate group so that they get that license. So where Okta Workflows comes in is it has the power to kind of extend some of those group rule functionality out and to talk to any API. And today we're going to be focusing on how we can use the Jamf Classic API and the Jamf Pro API to accomplish some of those automations. So you can extend the capabilities of your existing Okta directory, and you can centralize management and coordination of all those onboarding and offboarding processes. You know, the built-in deprovisioning and provisioning functions in Okta are great, but if you've been an Okta admin for any amount of time, and depending on the age of your organization, you may run into examples where, let's say, a user's account was created in Slack, Zoom, Microsoft Office, any of these other services. If they were a user before single sign-on was implemented, there's, edge cases and examples where they may not be properly deprovisioned when someone exits the company. And you may need to have a manual task for either someone on IT or even another department to go and verify that everyone's access has been cut off. So Okta Workflows is able to use the API for any vendor to ensure that some of these things that you want to automate really do happen. And you have an auditable trail in the logs to ensure that that was the case. You don't need to code with Okta Workflows at all. I'm personally comfortable using Bash, and I'm starting to learn a little Python, but it's great for visual learners. If you're good and comfortable with kind of a drag and drop interface like much of Mac OS, you're going to have a lot easier time building and testing your automations in something like Workflows, where you can visualize everything in front of you, than if it's just all text in a script. And at least for me personally, it might be easy to lose your place or your thought process if it's not directly in front of you. So I do just want to post here, these will be at the end as well. I just want to again emphasize that everything we're doing today is using the Jamf Classic API and the Pro API. So anything that we're doing here in Workflows could technically be accomplished using Bash with, say, using curl, or Python with requests. But Okta Workflows, again, because it kind of visualizes everything, at least for me and hopefully for a lot of you out there, just makes the process of building and testing these automations a lot easier. So what we're looking at here is just a very brief example of what a basic Okta workflow could be. And we'll break it down a little bit further. But in this example, on the very far left, this event card is essentially listening for whenever a new Okta user is created. At the very bottom of the card, these are essentially all of the JSON objects and values that are returned from a response body from that API. In this case, the Okta API. The next card to the right, we're just using a get method. We're just reading all of the user info based off of the attributes from the previous card. And then on the far right, we're just using, again, some of the responses in that JSON body that you might get from using, Python or Bash. And we're just dragging and dropping all of our desired attributes into the far right. In this example, to create a new record in Salesforce. So we're going to take a look at 4 different examples today. All 4 of these examples, again, will be posted on my GitHub. You'll be able to download them and import them into your own instance of Okta Workflows. So it essentially acts as a template for you to kind of build your own automation at your organization. So we'll take a look at reinstalling the Jamf framework, locking devices when someone exits, so that could be iOS or Macs, adjusting static groups, so kind of almost treating them dynamically as if they were a smart group in Jamf. And then finally, we'll take a look at unlocking kind of local Mac user accounts using an Okta workflow automation. So just at a basic level to begin with, whenever you want to create a new workflow, a new automation, you need to have your connections set up and configured in Okta Workflows. Jamf does have a pre-built connector for the Classic API. It's using basic authentication at the moment, and I've been in touch with workflow support, and they have indicated that the Jamf connector will be updated to support a bearer token in the future. The Classic API, again, has a pre-built connector, but at the moment, if you want to use anything, any endpoints in the Pro API, those are available because, again, Okta Workflows will work with any API. It's just in this case, we'll have to make a custom API connector in order to use the Jamf Pro endpoints. So I had a very, very brief example in a previous slide, but I just wanted to kind of break down what each card does or can do in a workflow. And if you haven't used Okta Workflows before, the kind of visual layout is horizontal, left, right. So when you're dragging and dropping, it might be attributes to a card directly to the left or right of what you're doing, or you might even be clicking and kind of holding at the edge of your browser window until it kind of moves on and scrolls horizontally for you to place that variable or attribute that you're trying to use. So the very first card, always the one that starts your flow, that is the event card. This could be an app event. So a very common use case, because again, this is Okta Workflows, so this is their product. So there's going to be a pretty robust list of events. Essentially, any event that is gatherable in the Okta system log, it's very likely that there's going to be an event that you can use here in your workflow automations. So a great example would be user created, user deprovisioned, user password reset, user reset MFA. All of these are kind of really common actions that might occur in your Okta instance that you can then build automations off of. You can also use any webhook. So Jamf has webhooks. One great example is, let's say you want to add someone to an Okta group whenever someone enrolls their Mac or enrolls their BYOD mobile device. You can use that webhook as the very first event card and then build the rest of the automation to either, let's say add someone to an Okta group, or maybe even assign something using another vendor's API. And finally, you can use either just like a manually scheduled card. So you would physically go to the Workflows portal and invoke the flow, the automation that you want to run. Or it could be scheduled like a cron job. So, every second Thursday or, every Monday morning at 8 a.m. And there'll be an example of a scheduled event flow later on in this presentation. So that was the first card, always the one on the far left. Every card to the right of it is going to be a combination of either an app action or an app function. So an app action is really just a term for any API endpoint from any vendor. So for Jamf, that could be, using the get method to read a user or read a computer object using the API. You could be using the post method to, add someone to a static group. You can delete. You can use the delete method to remove someone from a static group in Jamf, or any other group in any other vendor's API. The app function cards, this is really where the no code functionality of Okta Workflow shines, because let's say you're familiar with a coding language. Personally, for me, it's Bash. For you, let's say it's Python. Even if you're well versed, it still might take more time to go and code that out than it would be to just click a couple cards and drag a few variables over, especially if you're doing a lot of iteration in your testing when you're doing these automations. Things like some great examples would be you want to pluck a value from a JSON object from an API response body, or you need to convert dates and times. These are all great examples of things that might take a lot of time, especially if you're getting started out with coding, either Bash or Python. Instead of having to research, stop what you're doing just to kind of learn some core functionality of a coding language, you're saving time, especially during testing, by just be able to add and drop and test around and play around with some of these cards. So that's the basic structure of a workflow. The first example that we're looking at is reinstalling the Jamf framework. So why would you want to do this? This is actually a pretty recent feature addition to the Jamf Pro API. I think it's great. You might run into examples with your Mac fleet where, let's say, the Jamf framework might still be showing inventory updates, but the computer still isn't checking in for whatever reason. or you might notice some policies are running on the device that are set to check in or log in, but maybe some others aren't. And a lot of those symptoms, whether a Mac is just not responding at all or having intermittent communication with Jamf, a really great solution is just to reinstall the Jamf framework. In the past, that might have involved, manually contacting the user, working with them, to install a package or to enter in some credentials in order to get that accomplished. Now we can do this without any user interaction and using the Jamf Pro API. So it's very common, in my org especially, to have some smart groups based off of when the last time a Mac is checked in. So I'll have a smart group, not checked in for 14 days, not checked in for 30 days, not checked in for 90 days. And, depending on how large these groups can get, at some point you either need to do a cleanup so that you can free up some licenses for users that you actually have. Maybe your IT team is just running behind, or you're short-staffed. Someone hasn't had the time to go through and erase and reinstall a pile of Macs. Maybe there's a closet somewhere full of Macs that you intend to donate and erase, but nothing's happened to it yet. Maybe you have a set of users that are current employees, but maybe are a little more technically minded than you'd like, and they know how to disable the Jamf framework on their Mac if they have admin access. So these all might be various reasons why you might want to test and say, let me see if I can reinstall this framework, and if it starts responding again, great. Then you're able to successfully manage it. And if the Jamf framework can't be reinstalled because it's a pending command, it never happens, that might be a clue that either something is more seriously going on with the Mac, or it might be a hint that, hey, maybe that Mac is just sitting in a drawer somewhere, and that's why it's not communicating. So the Jamf redeploying the Jamf framework is using the Jamf Pro API. You will have to use a custom API connector in Okta Workflows in order to get this done. And part of that flow is both generating and then invalidating the bearer token for each, endpoint action that you'd like to run. So what we're looking at now is a parent flow. We'll show an example of a child flow in a moment, but really what this helps you do is make modular actions in workflows so that if you have something that's repeatable that you might want to reuse in some other automation, you're not having to go and rebuild your action or function cards manually by hand, or even just kind of duplicating, an existing workflow and kind of editing around what you've done. One great example for where this would be helpful is an offboarding workflow. Typically, offboarding workflows are going to be the largest in your workflows instance, because there might be a lot of different systems that have to be deprovisioned, maybe multiple alerts. Let's say certain managers might want to know that something happened. You might want to send a webhook, let's say to a Slack channel, to let it know that a certain automation was successful or not. So these tend to cause kind of the offboarding workflows to slowly creep and get larger in size. So what you can do is, if you notice, I'm going to apologize because I mentioned earlier that Okta Workflows kind of works horizontally, where you're scrolling left and right. if I were to take a screenshot of the entire workflow, the images would be really small and it would be difficult for everyone to see. So what we're seeing right now is really just a portion of this flow. But on the very far left, the event card, that's a scheduled flow. So what I'm doing is saying once a month, every 30 days, I want these actions to happen. So the next card to the right of the scheduled flow, this is our custom API connector. And we're just using the get method with a Jamf Pro, I believe in this case, yeah, we are using the Jamf Classic API and this initial card. What we're doing is we're just reading this smart group in Jamf. And again, this could be, let's say, a smart group of computers that haven't checked in 14 days or 30 days or 90 days. I believe in my case, I'm checking to make sure that, let's say I don't want that 90-day smart group to get too large. So I want to intervene at that 30-day mark. So it's pulling all of the computers in that smart group for Macs that haven't checked in 30 days. And then it's sending each response body to a child flow where the rest of our automation takes place. So this child flow, really all we're doing is extracting that Jamf computer ID from the parent. The very first card in this child flow is a compose card. And really this is just free text. And you can type in anything, pull in variables from other cards and other objects. Makes it a very versatile card because essentially what we're doing is then taking, we're kind of dynamically building the API endpoint because at the very end, we need to insert that computer ID. So because we have the computer ID now from the parent flow, we can now send that post request out to the Pro API to reinstall the framework. What's kind of cut off at the end here is where it's then going and invalidating that bearer token that is performing this action with the Jamf Pro API. I, again, really encourage everyone to go ahead and download the template that I have on GitHub so that you can see how this works in your own environment. It's also great because it kind of shows you an example of both generating and invalidating the Jamf Pro bearer token, and you can reuse that in any other automation flow that you have that might need that token. So that's redeploying the Jamf framework. The other really common automation that we have at Disco is locking devices when a user offboards and exits. So similar to the redeployment workflow, we're going to have parent and child flows. The parent flow is just kind of that larger offboarding automation. The child flow in this case is specifically just the Jamf Classic API post method to go and lock that Mac. So, kind of briefly show an example here. On again, this is the child flow, so we aren't seeing the initial parent here. But on the far left, we are receiving the computer ID from the parent flow. We're extracting that ID value from that response body object. We have a compose card that's just free text where I can paste in my API endpoint. I can use that variable essentially at the very bottom of the object get card. There's an output field that I've dragged over into the compose field. That output is the computer ID value. Then on the far right, in this case, I am still using the Jamf Classic API, but as an example, because as I mentioned, you can use any API with Okta Workflows. Using the built-in Jamf connector does make things a lot simpler and quicker. But just to show you an example here, you can just use a raw request to post this command out to Jamf and get that computer locked. This is one of our kind of most kind of successful and coveted workflows because prior to this, prior to workflows in general, really, everyone in the IT team, would have this list of actions that had to be done when someone offboarded, and either one person was responsible for this, or it might even be divvied up amongst multiple team members, or we may even have to have contacted admins or other users in other teams to perform certain actions. So instead of having to, on Friday evening or Monday morning, go and get the list of exited users from our HR departments, manually search in the Jamf console for each Mac, click the management command to go lock the Mac, type in a PIN code or a message if desired. This is all seamless. And again, because it's using workflows, it's auditable using the workflows log and the Okta system log. So if we ever need to go back and confirm that an action happened, you can easily do that. So one of the best ways to use workflows is to treat static groups in Jamf as if they were smart groups, in the sense that you can dynamically add users or remove users to them based off some other action. Smart groups in Jamf are great. They're kind of a core tenet of how we manage Apple devices at Disco, but all of those smart groups are going to be based off attributes that are stored in Jamf itself. So what if you want to have an automation based off an attribute that Jamf doesn't have? So yes, sometimes you can get around this issue by creating extension attributes in Jamf, but ultimately, those attribute values are generally calculated or generated within Jamf. So one great use case for this, again, is when someone or a user offboards. So we do have a static a static computer group in Jamf, so that we can exclude exited computers from certain policies. Let's say if you want to force a software update or patch an app, depending on the number of computers or mobile devices that you have in Jamf, you might be wasting resources on the server if it's trying to send these commands to devices that aren't actively used. Someone's left the company, the Mac might be powered off or asleep somewhere. It might be sitting in a stack in, someone in HR's office, and it hasn't been unboxed from FedEx yet. So if we want an easy way to exclude users from certain policies, having that static group update from Okta Workflows is a really seamless way to not have to think about it at all. So again, this isn't the full flow. This is kind of a zoomed in section of a flow that we're using. But let's say the parent flow was that original offboarding flow, and it's now moved on to this child flow where it's adding a user to this static group. So, we've already gone and gotten the computer ID from the user in that parent flow. Here in the child flow, we're just using a kind of free-form compose text field to insert that computer ID into this XML. And then the XML is essentially like a variable that we can drag and drop over to the far right, where we have that put method using the Jamf Classic API. This example here is adding. Again, if you visit my GitHub, there will be, aside from an example of this, we'll have an example of removing a user from a static group as well. This works great, kind of referencing that very first example I had in this presentation of someone who changed teams at your organization and now their new team needs Microsoft Office. Let's say that you have a static group of users that are approved to have an Office license, and you have that static group scoped to a self-service policy so that the user can install Office on their own time, or let's say even just a policy to automatically install all of the Office suite. So if we have someone in that new team in Okta, they've been added to that new Okta group, we can then use this workflow to then add them to this Jamf static group. The final example that I want to touch on is unlocking local Mac user accounts. We use Jamf Connect at Disco, and it's a really helpful product not only for onboarding new users and getting their accounts created when they power on their Mac for their on their first day, but it's also great for password management because we want to ensure that we kind of keep this single sign-on ethos and have the user's Okta password be set as their Mac password as well. And we want to make sure that that stays in sync. Jamf Connect does a great job of this, either both kind of automatically or even warning the user if there's a sync issue. And this is, whether the user is changing their password directly in Okta or if they're changing their password in system preferences. Jamf Connect is doing a good job at handling that sync. What can happen, though, is if an Okta admin has to force reset a user's password, occasionally there's going to be some timing issues where, let's say, the user has maybe not set a new password yet. And depending if you have, let's say, a configuration profile on the Mac to either supplement or further enforce your password policy, there can be instances where the user is quickly or easily locked out of their account on the Mac, depending on the password state in Okta when an admin performs a forced reset. This could be either the admin in Okta setting a temporary password for the user, or it could be an instance where the admin sends the user a reset link or even sets a predetermined password for the user. So let's take a look at this workflow automation. Again, this is cut off a bit, and you can see this entire flow on my GitHub. But on the far left, the Okta event that's really helping us out and doing most of the work here for us is it's listening for specifically when an admin resets a Okta user password. So based off that event, we go and extract the user's email. We extract the user's email from that response body. We could then use, a compose card to generate that, that API endpoint that we're going to use. And in this case, we're going to post that command using the Jamf Classic API. So this is really helpful, especially when, let's say the Mac was asleep during this reset, or it was locked, let's say at a screensaver. The user comes back to their Mac. They may not know that the Okta password has been reset, and they kind of quickly get into a state where the Mac is locked out. They may even need to assistance from IT to be guided to go to recovery to go and unlock the user account, or manually reset the password using macOS recovery. This really avoids a lot of those headaches and a lot of kind of one-on-one time between IT and the user. So that concludes the Okta workflow examples that I have today. It took a while for me to start with Okta workflows. It can be very intimidating at first, especially when you may not have some coding experience and you're kind of wanting to develop the automations at your organization. And if you are in that situation, I strongly encourage you to visit the link at the very bottom of this slide. It's for the Workflows office hours. The Okta Workflows team make themselves available on a daily, if not daily, it's at least a weekly basis, where you can either call in for an individual session with someone on the Okta Workflows team, or kind of in a community session. I think the most I've ever experienced is like 4 or 5 other users, where you kind of go in a round robin style, and everyone presents an issue that or they're having, or a question that they may have on workflows. Anytime I've gotten stuck, they have been an invaluable resource, and I really, really encourage everyone to take advantage of their team's time. Also have links here for Okta documentation on Okta workflows, on the Jamf Classic API connector for Okta workflows. We have a link for that in the Jamf Marketplace. And at the very top, that is the link to my GitHub. That is also what the QR code will redirect you to. And again, I will have the 4 examples that I previously talked about. We'll also have a few other workflows that we didn't have time to cover today that you may find helpful at your org. Well, I just want to thank everybody again for attending. I will be in San Diego. Please come grab me and say hi. And thank you. Have a great day.